Let's start off with a logical slide. If I can get my clicker to up. My clicker just woke up. It's nice to, it's really nice to be in Norway. I'm from British Columbia. And nice, Norway and British Columbia, we got a lot in common, right? We're both serious about our mountains. We live near our oceans. And you guys will find this amusing, but it freaks the Australians out. But yeah, this is a camera that I sit between my house and my neighbor's place. We call it the Animal Highway. There's a green belt in behind. And this is Wednesday morning, about 5 a.m. Wednesdays is garbage day in my neighborhood. So he's just dropping by to see if I put out my garbage early. That's all. I didn't realize this till I put the camera in. He's like there every week. And he's an optimist because I never put my garbage out early. Although this bear, he's a pretty good bear. If you do put your garbage out early, he'll tend to just pop the can open and take the bag and go into the ravine with it. So basically the bear takes your garbage out for you. That's a good bear. Thanks so much for coming to see me. My name is Richard Campbell. I wrote my first line of code in 1977. Now, that's not the most important thing to happen in 1977. The most important thing to happen in 1977 was Star Wars. All right, so we have our priorities straight. That computer was a TRS-80 Model 1. It had a whole 4K of memory, a cassette tape player for storing programs on. I was playing, I think that's Star Trek on there right there. It was running a version of BASIC not made by Microsoft. It was actually a tiny BASIC, and it only had 3 error messages. What? How? And sorry. Which I still think is the best error message ever. What is object not found, but sorry. I make a few podcasts. Any .NET Rocks listeners? Oh, wow. Awesome. So my friend Carl Franklin started .NET Rocks back in 2002. I was a guest in 2004, became co-host in 2005. We're at 1554 as of yesterday, so a few shows. I also make a show for IT pros called Run As Radio, once a week, every Wednesday since April of 2007. And briefly, for a few years, and it actually relates to the story I'm about to tell, we made a show called The Tablet Show, and I'll explain why later. So we're going to talk a little bit about Microsoft, and it's fun to talk about Microsoft if you use their logos. That's the 1977 Microsoft. That's the disco logo. And of course, this is when Bill Gates drops out of Harvard to write a version of BASIC for the IMSA 8800, the Altair. Right from the very beginning, Microsoft was about programming languages. And the only copy I could find of that original language, this is in the Computer History Museum in San Jose. And yeah, paper tape version of it. Although this was actually like the second edition. This is the 8K version because, ooh, memory. But it's interesting to think in terms of Microsoft started out as a programming language company. And what Bill's insight was at that time in the 70s, software came free with the hardware. So when you bought the hardware, it came with software. And it wasn't very good software. And every time you upgraded your hardware, replaced your hardware, you needed all new software. They really had no relationship between each other. And so he was trying to sell software separately. Rather than get caught in that hardware cycle and all of the problems that were happening there, he started building programming languages that would work across hardware. So if you learned how to program in BASIC on the Altair, you could apply it to the Heathkit. Or on the Apple II, you could apply it to the TRS-80 Mod 3. That was the idea. Now, if you fast forward a little into the 1980s, one would argue Microsoft loses their way, and we can blame IBM for that. Because there's this whole story about how IBM needed an operating system for their microcomputer, the AT5050. And so they went outside of the organization to find that operating system, and they originally approached Kilgore, the guy who made CP/M, and he wasn't home that day. He was out flying his airplane instead. And so then they went to Bill, and Bill said, I'll get an operating system, and went and bought one, and then modified it. It became MS-DOS, and suddenly Microsoft was an operating systems company, and, well, we all know what happened from there. That ultimately morphed into Windows. The 1990s version is where our story about .NET actually begins, and it starts with Visual Studio. So if we back up to 1997, so more than 20 years ago, Microsoft had a whole host of different programming languages that they were now shipping. They still made a version of Basic. Now they had their Visual Basic, which they'd started in 91, but this is 97, so they're actually fairly far down the path, version 5. They also made a definitive version of C++. Those were sort of their two biggest products. They had acquired Fox Pro, and they were still shipping it in the box, and they had made a version of Java called J++. And they had their first attempt at web development tool called InterDev, and we won't talk about that anymore. But each one of these programming environments had its own editor, its own debugger, its own environment, and its own interfaces hooks into Windows. And as they had more and more of them, it got very expensive to maintain. And so there was this vision about creating a unified development space. This is what Visual Studio is about. It was a lie, but it was a good lie. Because the unified UI, IDE that was actually in Visual Studio was only used by InterDev and J++. VB had its own, C++ still had its own, Fox Pro still had its own. The next version they put out, they changed the numbering system. They went from years to numbers. They started with 6 because numbers are hard. And they renumbered everything to 6. Now, it was the 6th version of Visual Basic, so it was VB6, and they could make C++ look like a 6. It was actually the 2nd version of InterDev. They called it 6. It was also the last version of InterDev, and nobody's unhappy about that. And it was the 3rd version of J++, which they also called 6. And it was also the last version of that because Sun Microsystems got a little upset with what Microsoft was doing with their version of Java. And there was a lawsuit, and they stopped making their own version of Java. But still, oh, by the way, still separate IDEs for Visual Basic, C++, Fox. They never did unify. So it was a good dream, but it never actually came together. But the biggest issue really was that interface to Windows. Microsoft is shipping new versions of Windows on a regular basis in this era. And these ultimately are how we're viewing our applications. And so they want those new features in Windows to appear in the programming languages. But each team has its own runtime. And so there's sort of a battle about what features will be surfaced and how they'll be surfaced. And the Windows team does not like that. But let's take a little detour around other important things that are happening. This is in 1998. And I love this picture. It's a Getty picture. They both just look so darn happy, don't they? And it's because they don't know what's coming. This is July of 98. And it's really going to hit the fan in about a month. Now, we forget, this is a long time ago, but there was a time when Bill was considered a master of the universe. This is a Time magazine cover from June of 95, when they were calling him literally the master of the universe. He had a goal of putting a PC on every desktop, and by 95, with Win95, he'd achieved this goal. And they were celebrating that. But fast forward back to a month after that Getty picture was taken in August of 98, and he's being deposed by a Senate committee in the United States. And if you want, you can watch this deposition on YouTube. It is there to watch. Bill doesn't act very well in this. He is pretty dismissive of the Senate committee. And now, admittedly, he is talking to politicians. So we know how intelligent that whole conversation is going to go, but he didn't help himself. And this is the beginning of the Department of Justice suit against him that ultimately finds Microsoft to be a pernicious monopoly. That's the ultimate charge. And that's the Time magazine cover in November of 99. Very American thing, you know, to take their heroes and turn them down and now bust Bill. And I won't deny for a moment that Microsoft had acted in a monopolistic way on certain behaviors. You could interpret them in a variety of ways. There were many solutions to this, but ultimately the case resulted in, by November of 1999, Microsoft being declared a monopoly and ordered to break up into two companies, an operating system company and an everything else company. Now, we know it didn't happen, but that was actually the declaration. And in January of 2000, this is from they look sadder now, don't they? It's only been 2 years, but this is Bill stepping down as CEO. Steve's going to take over, and Bill becomes chief architect. And Steve's first job is to stop Microsoft from being broken up, and he will succeed. It will take him almost 2 years. The consent decree will be finalized in November of 2001. But in the midst of all of that, they've been working on a new development environment. Since Studio had shipped in 98, there was this whole discussion about dealing with the problems that they were having with all these different programming languages. Nobody set out to make .NET. They were all feeling around for what we wanted to do for enterprise development. There were plenty of false starts in different projects. As I've been researching this for the past year and a half, there are many little projects that existed inside of Microsoft at this time that were all about trying to solve enterprise development at scale. And of course, Java was chugging along just fine at this time and being quite successful. So Microsoft's trying to find a solution to it. And Ballmer at times was talking about stuff like next generation Windows services, which eventually became next generation web services, which actually never became anything at all. If you really want to talk about what becomes .NET, you talk about three aspects. So this is in the 97, 98 time frame, three different people working on three different problems. And I'm going to put faces to it, but just understand these represent hundreds, even thousands of people ultimately. So the first aspect is this runtime issue. And it's Brian Harry that actually takes on the runtime issue. He's put in place to figure out how can we make a common runtime between these different languages, all surfacing features of Windows to programmers. The next aspect is led by Anders Halsberg. Now, Anders had originally come to Microsoft from Borland to build tooling for Java. But since the Sun Microsystems injunction had come in place and Microsoft wasn't allowed to do anything with Java at all, he was basically offered an opportunity he'd never had before in his life to build a new language from scratch. Anders' history had been taking existing languages and making better versions of it. He did it with Turbo Pascal, he did it with Turbo Basic, he did it with Delphi, and he was working on Java. And now he was basically offered, do you want to make a language from scratch? And I would also point out, Microsoft at that time did not make languages from scratch either. They made their own versions of C++ and BASIC and so forth. And here was this opportunity to actually make a new language. And so we know that language would eventually become C#. It was initially codenamed COOL, as in C Object-Oriented Language. And you'll still see, if you look at some of the old documentation, this reference to COOL, that's what they're talking about. So, and finally, Mr. Guthrie. Scott joined Microsoft in 1997, graduated from Duke University. It is the only job he's ever had. He joins the Visual Studio team under a guy named Mark Anders. He's a young man, he's in his 20s, and they ship Studio 6, and he was specifically working on the NT option pack, so IIS-4, in November of 1997. And it's common practice at Microsoft that after you have a major version ship like that, you take a couple weeks off, recharge the batteries, get ready for the next version. That put him into mid-December, so most people took the rest of December off too. But not Scott. Scott didn't want to go home to North Carolina. He wanted to make a better way to program on the web because he did not like IIS and he certainly didn't like active server pages. And so he hacked away for a month, and I have now actually seen his notebooks from 1997. When we were doing interviews around putting this book together, he produced the notebooks from 1997 with his handwritten notes of exactly these problems. And in January of 98, he shows off to the team a prototype, what he called ASP Plus at the time, and the scripting language is Java. Because C# doesn't exist yet. And they go, this is really cool, you can't use Java. So that's the beginning of all of that. So, but these three aspects, the runtime, the interface to Windows, a language, some way to program in, and web. You know, we are in the late 90s, early aughts, and the internet is a big thing. And so we're trying to get better ways to program against the web. Those are the three aspects that come together to eventually be called .NET. The first time we even hear the term .NET is at the Professional Developers Conference, the PDC, in Orlando in July of 2000. And people were surprised, actually. Microsoft had been kind of quiet. This had been a tough 2 years with all the things going on around the Department of Justice. Nobody was really expecting anything big coming out, and so they were kind of blindsided. But interesting part in the announcement in 2000, this is now Ballmer's Microsoft. He talks about, even then, a new platform based on internet standards, and that both C# and the common language infrastructure would be published as ECMA specifications. And under the hood, this is part of their negotiation with the Department of Justice to be a more open company. Microsoft is heading down this path of what they call the open source initiative, or the shared source initiative. They're not actually planning on being open source. This is also the time when Steve says Linux is a cancer. But they are making their source code available to companies who need it. So one of the original complaints in that whole Department of Justice trial was that companies like Real Networks and Netscape would complain that their applications didn't run as well on Windows as Microsoft's own, and that they believed that inside Windows there were a if Netscape code. And it wasn't true. And ultimately, the only way to really prove that was to make the source code available. And so even back then, the source code was available to companies that showed they had a need. You couldn't compile it, you certainly couldn't modify it, and you certainly couldn't publish it, but you could see. And so often that would help them build better software because they could now see how Windows actually works under the hood, and they could make those improvements. So producing these ECMA specifications was part of this negotiation to keep the company from being broken up. Now, at the same time, we get Windows 2000. Now, Windows 2000 is a very important version of Windows because this is when the two lines merged. So we'd had the 9X line from 95, 98, 98 SE. Let's not talk about Millennium. And then you had the NT line, 3.1, 3.5, 3.5.1, 4, right? The stronger kernel, not as nice a piece of software. And here they were bringing the two together. Bunch of things that happened in 2000 just to get yourself focused on that era. I mean, admittedly, 18 years ago. This is the point where Microsoft starts committing to only Intel. The NT line, up until now, it also supported Alpha, the Alpha chip, the MIPS chip, and the PowerPC chip. But nobody was using them for the most part, and it just wasn't worthwhile. So they finally said it's Intel only. This is also the point where Microsoft commits to TCP/IP as the primary default networking stack. Up until this point, it had been NetBEUI. So that's not that long ago that we were only getting that sort of stuff figured out. But you know, when folks talk about this idea of the Wintel hegemony, arguably it starts here. It doesn't last very long, but this is the point where Microsoft is all in on Intel, and you know, they're building this version of Windows. One of the side effects of that ECMA specifications being published was a very young man by the name of Miguel de Icaza, who at an O'Reilly conference in 2001 announces the Mono project. He won't ship anything until about 2004, but you know, you're working with volunteers at the beginning of open source, before GitHub and so forth. Like, these were hard problems to solve. But he builds, based on the ECMA specifications, what they call the clean room version of .NET eventually. We get the release candidates of .NET in 2001 at the PDC in Los Angeles. We also get IE6. Now, they released IE6 a bit early. The CSS specification 1 had not been ratified at that point. And the real sin of IE6 is actually, at that point, the team essentially dissolved. They went to work on another project, a project that would eventually be codenamed Avalon. So IE6 hangs around for a long time, because they also ship Windows XP. We called it Windows 2000 with the Fisher-Price interface, because it was very cute. It had all curvy bubble shapes and things. It was very nice, right? It also didn't support USB at that time. You know, that's before any of that stuff. And it came with IE6. But more important, in that year, in 2001, with the consolidation of the operating systems, the malware authors got to work. In 2001, you get the Anna Kournikova virus, you get Code Red 1, Code Red 2, the NIMDA virus. Like, there's a lot of hacking going on, right? Welcome to the internet. Here's your exploited machine. And Gates, by January of 2002, no longer the CEO, he's chief architect, publishes a document called Trustworthy Computing. This is an internal letter inside of Microsoft. He'd done the same thing with the internet tidal wave, where he basically told Microsoft, the internet's going to be important, let's focus on that. The Trustworthy Computing essentially said, everybody stop what you're doing and work on security. We need to solve this. And obviously the focal point of that was Windows. And so with XP having just shipped, Service Pack 1 is already planned, as is normal when building a big piece of software. There's things that get cut along the way before you actually ship. Those things were all being pushed onto Service Pack 1. This initiative being declared means they would make Service Pack 2 the security version. They were going to do major fixes to the security concerns around Windows for Service Pack 2. And a non-trivial chunk of the Windows team, mostly very senior people, were focused on that Service Pack 2. It'll have important impact on Windows coming up. That's where they're focused. We can't talk about .NET without talking about Windows, for better or worse, because Ultimately, when .NET ships in February of 2002, its marketing pitch is the corollary or the opposition to Java. Java's pitch had always been any platform, one language. And now Microsoft came with .NET saying, here's 22 languages, one platform, Windows. The real trick is trying to name 22 languages. I got the list. It's 22 languages. I don't know how many of these still exist. I mean, back in the early days, they called it C#.NET. Now they just call it C#. There was a C++.NET that virtually nobody uses, VB.NET, which is kind of in the same boat. J# was actually a bridge for J++ developers to migrate their code into J#, which is put it in the runtime model, so they could ultimately move to C# if they wanted to. So Anders was taking care of folks that had worked on J++ with him, and he moved up to the new version. To this day, you can still buy COBOL.NET. It's produced by Fujitsu. It's in the Visual Studio Marketplace. If you have an inclination, drop $600 on COBOL, you too can own a copy. IBM still supports a version of Fortran for .NET. Another thing that gets announced in that same time span in 2002 is a project called Rotor. And it was part of the shared source initiative. And it was big chunks of the source code of .NET, excluding a lot of the Windows-related things like ADO.NET and so forth, being available for academic license. So the original shared source initiative was for industry only under strict lock and key with very specific rules. They broadened that with Rotor to anybody in the academic space who wanted to take a look at .NET. They could have copies. Again, you couldn't compile it, couldn't modify it, you weren't allowed to share it, but you could have access to all the source code of .NET. By 2003, we get the second version of .NET, which we call 1.1 because numbers are hard. And this is where we sort of get things a little more mature. The bugs are kind of out of it. It's an okay version of .NET, but it's not ultra reliable. We won't really get a great version of .NET until the third version, which they'll call version 2. Excellent. In 2003 at the PDC, the tone of the PDC changes. So the previous two PDCs had been all about .NET. Now it was all about the next version of Windows. So if you go back and think 95, 98, 98 SE, NT4, Windows 2000, XP, Microsoft had shipped an OS almost every year for 6 years. And they had dominated the market with XP. It was 95% of workstations ran XP. They utterly owned the space. And what happens when you're a market leader? Well, now you can do whatever you want. And so the Windows team, which had been happily split up, dealing with the SP2 problem and so forth, they start prototyping the next version of Windows. And they kind of go a little nuts. Now, that was in 2002, and they dial that back to a simpler version. And in 2003, at the PDC, they talk about the dial-back version. So the code name for XP was Whistler. Now, Whistler is a ski mountain not far from where I live. The next ski mountain over is a mountain called Blackcomb. So the original prototypes for the next version of Windows after XP were called Blackcomb. But it was this object-oriented monster that pretty quickly they figured they were never going to build. So they're like, let's dial this back and simplify it. Well, in between the ski mountain of Whistler and the ski mountain of Blackcomb, there is a bar called the Longhorn Bar. So it was Windows Longhorn. And in Windows Longhorn at the PDC in 03, they talked about the 3 pillars of Longhorn. And it was Avalon, Indigo, and WinFS. So Avalon was a new visualization system. It was a way for us to have Windows actually use our GPUs, our video cards properly. We'd had DirectX for years, but in Windows itself, it drew directly on the screen as if the screen was memory, bit blitting. It was inefficient. It didn't take advantage of the hardware available. But pretty much every computer made at that time now had a proper video card. And so Avalon was how they were going to bring that to Windows. Indigo was a set of communication protocols. Any kind of communication between any range of machine from within the process to across the internet would work essentially the same way, fully configurable. And WinFS was an object-oriented file system that was going to allow us to treat files as if they're objects with all their capabilities. It was a great idea, except for the part where it didn't work. Anyway, by 2004, this has now been 3 years since XP shipped. We get Service Pack 2 of XP. And one could argue, if they had only called this XP version 2, a lot of pain would have been solved. But they wanted everybody to install SP2 because it was the security version. It had a lot of fixes in it, but it broke some software, which generally means it should have been called a new version, right? Service packs are supposed to fix bugs, but not break anything. New versions can break things. But Microsoft was so concerned about it actually getting deployed, they called it a service pack. If they had called it version 2, we wouldn't have had some of these other problems that we have as we move further along. And roughly at the same time, we get Studio 2005. So we've gotten rid of the .NET moniker, it's just Studio. 2005 is version 2 of the CLR and framework. I would argue this is the manifestation of what we always hoped for in .NET. Very much a strong enterprise class version of a development tool. This is also when we get 64-bit support for the first time. This is largely caused by AMD. AMD came up with their extension set called x86-64, and a technical fellow inside of Microsoft named Dave Cutler published a paper called Windows on Windows, where he explained how in 64-bit mode, we'd be able to run 32-bit apps without any meaningful modifications through this thing he called the thunking layer. And it solves the problem. Intel had been working for years on a processor called Itanium that was supposed to be pure 64-bit. We ultimately called it Itanic, because that's how well it sold. And so when AMD comes up with this great solution for 64-bit, Intel jumps on board with their own version called IA64, or called EM64T. And our magic in Studio is that now you can simply compile to 64. Although we were given this great option called compile as any. The idea of compile as any is that the just-in-time compiler would simply look at the OS that you're running on and compile accordingly. Now, as long as it always compiled on a 32-bit operating system, you were fine. If you compiled as any on a 64-bit operating system, it would crash. Ask me how I know. There were driver problems. It just didn't work. The compile as any didn't do what we needed to do. However, the other important thing that happened in this version, this is C# 2.0. We get our first versions of generics. And they will have a huge impact on what happens with .NET going forward. Very important part. And it's exciting that Mads Torgersen and Don Syme are here, because these are the, Syme was principal for getting generics directly into .NET at this time. Mads will actually come on board in the next year, and we'll start working seriously on C#. Microsoft recognizes as they come out of the consent, they're in the consent decree and so forth, they need to sort of change their look and reach a larger audience. And they make a new conference called Mix. They do it in Las Vegas, and it's about the open web. This is also when they announce their first new browser, IE7. The guys who've been working on Avalon finished dealing in Longhorn, and they went back and worked on a new browser. So IE6 had come out in August of 2001. IE7 comes out in October of 2006. Why so long? The team was distracted. And this is what makes IE6 actually evil. And why Safari is now the new IE6. It was not compliant with standards, and it was popular. That's the sin, right? If lots of people use it, it's not compliant to standards, then what happens to web developers? Web developers try to build stuff to standard, and then they have to make an exception for this popular browser is not compliant with standards, which is why Safari now wins that title so well. We eventually purged our lives of IE6 by just stopping pages from running on it. Go get a real browser. I wonder if we're going to get there with Safari again. And this happened. So what went wrong? Well, the first thing is they ran out of time. What was the time limit? The time limit was 5 years. Most large customers at Microsoft buy volume license agreements. And the volume license agreement is not, I'm going to have 50 copies of Office and 100 copies of Windows, da-da-da-da-da. It's literally count up your employees. We're going to set a rate per employee. You get everything. That's how VLAs work. And in that VLA is a stipulation. You will get a new OS every 5 years. And nobody expected to hit that time limit. 5 years is a long time. They've been shipping an OS every year. XP ships November of 2001. Vista ships November of 2006. But only the Enterprise Edition, the version that's stipulated in the volume license agreement. It has to ship then. They don't want to redo all the volume license agreements. And it ships with non-trivial bugs. Now, there's a bunch of reasons why these problems existed. The security model had changed how the drivers work, so the drivers were a complete mess. They had rewritten huge chunks of code that may not have needed to rewrite, like the networking stacks. So they created a lot of complexity. But they were also counting on the fact that nobody was going to install it. Because no IT guy installs a V1 of anything. They wait for the first service pack. And by the first service pack, May of 2007, it would all be fixed. So who the heck installed the V1 of Vista? Product reviewers. Because it's their job. What else are they going to do? The Paul Thurrots, Mary Jo Foley's of the world installed it. And it was broken. They had serious problems. And they let the world know. My mother called me and said, I don't want any of this Vista on my computer. Like, I don't think you're qualified for an opinion, but okay. And the damage was done. And of course, they would fix it up eventually. And in the midst of all this chaos, we also, in order to get Vista out the door, they push out things like, they get rid of the 3 pillars, Avalon, Indigo. They get shoved back to the .NET team. And the .NET team renames them creative names like Windows Presentation Foundation and Windows Communication Foundation. There's also Workflow and Card Space. And I always liked Card Space, but apparently I was the only one. So this is kind of an emergency version of .NET. 3.0 didn't change the CLR at all. It just took on all the stuff that had come out of the Longhorn fallout. And they were busy trying to integrate that all together. And at that same time, this thing appears. Now, this is not a good phone. The original version of this phone was only 2G for starters. Like, it really was not that good a phone. And it is kind of the end of phones, too. I mean, after this phone, everything is a slab of flat glass. Before the iPhone, phones were cool. They had antennas and keyboards, and they slid out. And then after that, they're all slabs of black glass. But be that as it may, there's a reason Microsoft's fairly distracted dealing with what's happened with the operating system and trying to find their way forward on cleaning up the development environment. But at Mix, they do mention a new product. They called it Windows Presentation Foundation Extensions. And we did a show on .NET Rocks with Brad Abrams when he was talking about that. And Brad told us the secret. If you want a cool product name, give it a terrible code name. If you have a cool code name, like Avalon, you end up with a terrible product name, Windows Presentation Foundation. So his code name was Windows Presentation Foundation Extensions, and it became Silverlight. Much better product name. So this is first announced in December of 2006, ultimately was shipped in September of 2007. And is basically building an independent runtime for a subset of .NET, focused on C# and XAML. Although the first versions, all the coding was actually in JavaScript. They were really focused on media, but it would run on the Mac. So it was kind of a profound thing. And at that time, especially in 2007, the Mac still ran PowerPC. They would switch over to Intel shortly after that, and they made it work on both versions. And they iterated quickly. This is Scott Guthrie in action. And Guthrie was up to something. Like, as I've assembled this timeline, I've come to appreciate he clearly turns a switch in 2007. He's now a general manager in DevDiv, and he doesn't like the rate that we're putting out software, and he thinks that open source is important. And so he starts shipping Silverlight out of band. They push out 4 versions in the next 4 updates in like 10 months. He also hires Scott Hanselman, Phil Hack, and Rob Connery in the same month. We called them Scott Guthrie's Ninja Army. There were all these open source guys, and suddenly they were all in the company at the same time. And the way he recruited them is they've been working on an alternative to web forms that we'd eventually know as MVC. And there's an apocryphal story that's only half true of Scott Guthrie being invited to a conference in Austin. It was actually the Alt.NET conference. And Alt.NET was a movement that really was pressing on this idea that Microsoft Stack developers should be using more open source. There were good open source solutions out there that automatically using everything that Microsoft made was not necessarily a good choice. And Scott had been invited to attend the conference, to speak at it, and he was going to do a keynote there. And at that keynote, he showed off in public MVC for the first time, testable web development, in front of arguably the ideal audience for it, and caused a furor. And so by 2008, actually November 2007, we get Studio 2008. This is when the first version of Visual Studio Team System appears. We get .NET 3.5. We also get Link. And we also have the MVC product continuing to come out of band. By 2008, we're kind of an interesting place now. They've done some fixes to the framework. This is 3.5 SP1. We've got Silverlight up to version 2. We get the first public draft of HTML5. Again, it's hard to remember. It's only 10 years ago, right? This is in January of 2008. We start talking seriously about 2005. We now have the .NET 3 framework running in Silverlight on the Mac. So there's really a version of the CLR that's running on the Mac. Mono's now hit version 2 and is starting to run comparably. Miguel Diaz also announced his own version of a Linux-based version of Silverlight he calls Moonlight. So he's now implementing that as well. And the MVC ships in March of 2009 with an open source license. Now, because of lawyers, it was a Microsoft public license, which they were roundly crucified for. But it really was a highly permissive license. It's just that they built their own, and why would you do that? And in the midst of all of that, at the PDC in 2008, the new chief architect at Microsoft, Ray Ozzie, announces the cloud from the Microsoft side. AWS is already doing its thing. This cloud is called Windows Azure. Now, there's a lot of conversation about how Microsoft has many different large web products, and they're all running on their own infrastructure. We're going to try and unify that. We'll make that available to you. This is the early days of Azure, so they have this concept of the app role and the web role. It's a very unique programming model, but it was the beginning. And Windows gets cleaned up in October of 2009 with a product called Windows 7, which many still feel like is their favorite version of Windows. We actually get Azure in February of 2010. It ships with SQL Azure and support for .NET, Java, and PHP. Again, limited set of roles, limited set of capabilities, but interesting stuff. Also in 2010, literally a month later, the giant iPhone comes along. Now, this one, I think, distressed Microsoft more. They weren't so sure about the iPhone, but the iPad definitely freaked them out. And it didn't help that a month after it ships, in April of 2010, Steve Jobs puts out a letter called Thoughts on Flash. I think it published in the Wall Street Journal. And what he was really the text of it was, he was talking about how plugins and browsers were a vector for malware. And he pointed at Flash as an example of bad software that's hurting the browser. Now, what he was really concerned about was that Flash was killing iPads. It's just a battery eater. And he wanted to eliminate it. He didn't want the iPad to fail because his battery wouldn't last because Flash. And it's 2010, everybody uses Flash. So it's kind of a big deal. He's saying no Flash in Safari. But he couches in this malware terminology that eliminates all plugins, which means it also eliminates Silverlight as a plugin. And that's in April of 2010. Sort of the height of us loving Silverlight. There was this new device under iOS, and now we knew it wasn't going to run. And proof of Steve Jobs' influence, by the end of 2011, Adobe will stop making Flash for mobile. Right? Like he did drive it out. We got Studio 2010 in March of 2010, or April of 2010. This is the first product to really implement WPF. So Microsoft had WPF now around for almost 4 years, and it's sort of an orphan. They actually integrated it as part of Studio. The third version of WPF, which they numbered 4 because numbers are hard, actually cleaned up WPF a long way. Studio pushed it far. This is when F# arrives. Although they number it 4, it's actually the second version of F#, which is downloadable separately from Microsoft Research because numbers are hard. And we get Silverlight 4, a real 4, because it was actually the 4th version, which was our out-of-browser version of Silverlight, and it also supported Chrome, which was basically new at this time as well. I would argue the most important thing in terms of cultural shift inside of Studio 2010 is that it shipped with jQuery. So here was an open source tool set, and it was actually in the box with Studio. It was quite a big deal. And it left the normal jQuery license in place. There had been a push to say, Microsoft should have their own license on jQuery, and smarter people said, don't do that. That would be bad. And they actually left the normal license on jQuery. In order to make sure that jQuery was protected, they supported this idea of a foundation, initially called the jQuery Foundation, today known as the JavaScript Foundation. So specifically about covering off licensing and liability around a library that Microsoft was now directly supporting and contributing to for the developers. And the last PDC happens in October of 2010. So got Studio 2010 out in April, October of 2010. We see the last PDC. It's from the Microsoft campus. It's all streamed online. I think only 1,000 people went. And they were just an applause track, essentially, for the streaming. I mean, it's 2010, so streaming's still pretty new and hip at that time. I know we take it for granted today. But there was an interesting thing that happened at PDC, and that was that there was very little conversation about Silverlight. Professional Developers Conference, not talking about Silverlight. And Mary Jo Foley tracked down a fellow by the name of Bob Muglia, who ran Server and Tools at the time, and said, why aren't you talking about Silverlight? And Muglia said a bunch of things, but the line that was grabbed by everyone was, our strategy has shifted. And it ultimately cost him his job. He leaves Microsoft in January 2011. But the public's reaction, or more importantly, the press's reaction to that was Silverlight is dead. Now, it's not like Silverlight burst into flames or anything, but the reality was Silverlight was not going to run on iOS, and everybody had an expectation iOS was going to be important, and so literally their strategy had shifted. They were evaluating whether or not HTML5, JavaScript, which still in early days, it's only 2010, could actually do the job better. And people were not happy. Now, in 2011, we actually have an interesting time. This is the acceleration of JavaScript. So Google was making their V8 JavaScript engine. They ran it in Chrome. The Fox folks were making the Nitro engine, running in Firefox. And Microsoft had the Chakra engine that was now shipping in IE9. And over months in 2011, you saw rapid iterations of all of these browsers. It was sort of friendly competition. They would send each other cakes when they pushed out a new feature. This is when GPUs started being utilized by browsers, and pre-compilation came in, and JavaScript itself cleaned up, became a tighter, smarter, more comprehensive language, to the point where people started talking about running JavaScript outside of the browser, and we started seeing what was originally experimental projects like Node.js become much more mainstream. I mean, Node had started back in 2009, but by 2011, with all of the improvements in the V8 engine and the Chakra engine, you could run really fast server-side code in JavaScript. It was an interesting space to be thinking about. You're going to write code on the client in JavaScript. Could you write client code on the server in JavaScript as well? And that brings us to the fall of 2011. So in September of 2011, it's not PDC anymore, it's Build. And at Build, they talk about a new operating system called Windows 8. And it's going to be the tablet operating system. So they have sprinted from the response of the iPad to a version that will take care of all these things. And in 2012, we're going to have a new operating system, new server, and a new version of Studio 2012 that's going to allow you to do all the programming on all of this. This is also when the consent decree from 2001 actually ends. It originally was supposed to go for 5 years. It got extended twice. But in 2011, it actually ends. Now, you got to think about where Microsoft's head's at this moment. They start talking about JavaScript in such a serious way. This is also where they announced a thing called WinJS, that they were providing extensions for JavaScript programmers to program against Windows. Not that anybody did, but they provided them. I pulled the annual report for Microsoft in 2011 to look at where they were making their money. These are all the billion-dollar businesses that Microsoft has in 2011. And if you count them up, you realize that all of them, with the exception of 3, depend on Windows. The 3 that don't are Xbox, which is in the middle of cleaning up its red ring of death. So while it grossed more than $1 billion, it's spending like 4. Bing, which certainly brought in more than $1 billion while spending more than 2. And Skype, which is Finnish. And they spent $8 billion buying it. So, is it any wonder why Microsoft was doing everything they could to getting JavaScript to Windows? And the frustrations that .NET couldn't run everywhere, that Silverlight couldn't do all the things? But in the midst of all of that, this guy reappears. So Miguel Diaz-Casa had been doing his thing all along, not only just working on Mono, but he loves C#. One would argue he loves C# more than just about anybody. And he had built his own versions of C#, including one that ran against iOS. He called it MonoTouch. And in 2011, he got one running on Android. Called it Mono for Android, because that's a creative name. And right around that time, Attachmate bought Novell and wanted to shut everything down. They thought it was a waste of money, it wasn't going to go anywhere. And Miguel disagreed, and he called his friend Nat Friedman, and they formed a new company. Carl and I were at Build 2011, and we walked out of that conference and looked at each other and said, what if .NET didn't rock? Because we make a show called .NET Rocks. So we lit up another podcast. We lit up the tablet show. It was our contingency plan. We were worried. Lots of people were worried. The tablet show was going to be our conversation about cross-platform and so forth. We did the show for 3 years. 3 years later, by 2014, it was absolutely apparent that .NET still rocked, and we rolled the show into the main show and stopped making the tablet show separately. But I would argue this was the toughest point in 2011, this sort of moment. At the same time that Microsoft is focused on JavaScript, this guy's showing you can run C# on the platforms you said you couldn't run C# on. So he kind of creates the proof point on that. But the open source movement is still going on. And Microsoft in 2012 actually announced this thing called Microsoft Open Technologies. This is in April of 2012. It was nominally promoted as Microsoft making sure that their libraries, their products worked well with open source libraries. But it also had a big team of developers behind it. They were contributing to a lot of different open source projects. Typically, again, to make sure it worked well against the Windows stack. But it got broader than that. And by the time we get to Studio 2012, we have more open source libraries involved. We get support for the ARM processors. So temporarily, Microsoft went away from Intel and focused on ARM with those lightweight Windows tablets. And we had it available in Studio 2012. So you could actually compile to ARM if you wanted to. Most people remember Studio 2012 for exactly one thing, and that is the all caps menus, which was a huge crisis. People are freaking out about the all caps menus. At Build 2012, when they actually shipped Win 8, and they've been pushing hard on putting apps into the Windows stores, 75% of the apps in the Windows store at that time are C# and XAML. So Microsoft may not have been that focused on C# and the .NET stack, but we all were, and we were the one building the apps. And so the message was pretty clear that we're going to continue working in .NET, whether it's a focus for C#, focus on Windows or not. And in fact, this is pretty much the point where the focus on Windows starts to change. You know, companies technically turned a corner here, although we may not be aware of it. Now, we do get a version of Studio in 2013, which most importantly gets rid of the all caps menus. But then Microsoft renames Azure. And they get a new CEO, Satya Nadella, in February 2014. So we've changed. Windows is no longer the center of Microsoft. It's different now. And they start changing the names of their products. They make another build in April of 2014. And this is where Roslyn, the new version of C# is released, but it's released as open source and cross-platform. Anders Heilsberg himself deploys it onto GitHub on that day. The first version of TypeScript, version 1, actually comes out. Microsoft announces that Windows will be free on any device with a screen 9 inches or smaller. Windows, free. There was so much being announced in April 2014, it was hard to even get your head around it. It was coming so fast. And the .NET Foundation is formed, and they put Xamarin and a bunch of other key products as open source projects that should be supported. This is also when, in 2014, the HTML5 recommendation level finally actually comes along. It's not that long ago. And we get to Studio 2015. This is where we get Win 10, we get the Edge browser, MS OpenText, which has only been around for 3 years at this point, actually gets just rolled back into Microsoft. Because now, where they had been doing all the work on open source isolated in a separate entity, everybody inside of Microsoft was working on open source stuff to one degree or another. It's just part of the company. The same way we rolled Tablet Show back into .NET Rocks, they rolled their open source initiatives back into Microsoft. Microsoft actually takes it all very seriously. And we get Visual Studio Code. They rewrite .NET as an open source version. Quickly, too. First version is released in June of 2016. It's not great. The second version they call 1.1 is out in March of 2017 with Studio 2017. And the third version, numbered version 2, because numbers are hard, August of 2017. So what's next? Well, maybe they'll buy GitHub. What you're seeing is a comprehensive shift of the company. I mean, as much as buying GitHub is very cool, and there's a whole other conversation to be had by that, I think more relevantly, if you look at the beginning of this year, there's not a Windows group anymore. They've broken Windows apart, and part of it, what they call the client experience, now lives as part of developer division, and the server parts now live in Azure. They're still going to sell and ship Windows, but they don't recognize Windows as an independent product by itself. It is a part of a larger holistic whole. Microsoft is more of a development company than it's been since the 80s. And I don't know that all of Microsoft has comprehended that, much less the rest of us, that they have fundamentally changed their business now. They're a services business. They build languages and tooling for us to be able to utilize their services. That's the business today. They're less concerned about licensing software. They're more concerned about providing services. We're just still trying to understand all of that. I've been working hard on the past 18 months to make this into a book. I'm still probably a year away from getting it done, and I'm still getting my head around all these things. And I hope you're excited, because I certainly am. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great show.